Lena Whitmore, 34 years. I ended a relationship that looked perfect because of something no one else would have noticed. And the worst part is, for a long time, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was being sensitive, that I was expecting too much from something that was already good. But I wasn't. I was just the only one paying attention. If you had looked at my life from the outside, you would have said I was lucky. That word. Lucky. I had a long-term partner, Ethan. We'd been together for almost 8 years. Not married, but close enough that everyone assumed it was just a matter of time. We lived in a bright apartment in Seattle, with big windows, neutral furniture, and the kind of aesthetic that looks effortless but actually takes a lot of quiet coordination. We had routines. Sunday coffee at the same place. Friday takeout. Evenings that looked like shared space, even if we were doing different things. We didn't fight. That was something I used to say proudly. We just don't have that kind of relationship. And for a while, I believed that meant we were strong, stable, better than most. But stability can be misleading. Because sometimes, it's not peace. It's silence. Ethan was kind. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't distant in an obvious way. He didn't ignore me. He didn't do anything you could easily point to and say, that's the problem. He showed up. He remembered things. He made sure life worked. But over time, something changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just slowly. The way it always does. At first, it was small. Conversations got shorter. Not because we had less to say. Because we stopped trying to say more. We would sit next to each other on the couch, both on our phones, both present in the same physical space. But not really with each other. And I noticed it. That's the difference. I noticed. Hey, I said one night, about 6 months before everything ended. Ethan looked up from his laptop. Yeah. Do you ever feel like we don't really talk anymore? He frowned slightly. We talk all the time. I nodded. I mean, real conversations. A pause. Then he shrugged. I think this is just what happens over time. That answer. It stayed with me. Not because it was wrong. Because it felt final. Like he had already accepted something I wasn't ready to accept. And instead of pushing further, I let it go. That's how it starts. You notice something. You question it. You get a simple answer. And you convince yourself it's enough. Because it's easier than digging deeper. Easier than risking discomfort. Easier than facing the possibility that something important is changing. So I adjusted. I told myself this was normal. That relationships evolve. That not everything has to feel intense or exciting to be meaningful. And for a while, that worked. Until it didn't. Because what starts as a small absence eventually becomes something you can't ignore. The build wasn't loud. It never is. It showed up in moments. Ethan would come home and go straight to the shower without asking about my day. Not intentionally. Just automatically. We would eat dinner without really looking at each other. Watch something. Go to bed. Repeat. Week after week. Nothing wrong. But nothing present either. And the strange thing was, everything still functioned. We still laughed sometimes. Still planned things. Still existed as a couple in every visible way. But inside, something felt off. Like I was slowly disappearing from my own relationship. I remember one specific moment. We were out with friends. Dinner. A long table. Everyone talking, laughing, sharing stories. And Ethan was engaged. More than usual. Smiling. Listening. Asking questions. Being present in a way I hadn't seen in a while. And I realized something. He still had that version of himself. The attentive one. The curious one. The one who made people feel seen. He just wasn't bringing it home anymore. That realization. It stayed with me. Because it changed the narrative. This wasn't about him being tired. Or stressed. Or naturally becoming more distant over time. This was about where he chose to be present. And where he didn't. I didn't confront him then. I didn't say anything. But something shifted inside me. Because once you see that, you can't unsee it. And suddenly, every small moment starts to matter more. Every silence feels heavier. Every missed connection feels intentional, even if it isn't. That's how tension builds. Quietly. Until one day, Something small happens. Something that shouldn't matter that much. But does. Because it confirms everything you've been feeling. For me, it wasn't a message. It wasn't cheating. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was something simpler. And somehow, worse. But I didn't know that yet. At that point, I was still telling myself everything was fine. Still believing that what I felt wasn't enough to question the entire relationship. Still thinking that if something was really wrong, it would be obvious, clear, undeniable. I didn't understand yet that the most important problems in a relationship rarely look like problems at all. They feel like absence, like something missing you can't fully explain. And the longer you ignore it, the harder it becomes to pretend it isn't there. That was the stage I was in, right before everything changed, right before the moment that made me realize I wasn't imagining anything. Something really had shifted, and I was the only one willing to admit it. The hardest kind of loneliness is the kind that happens next to someone. Not dramatic loneliness. Not abandonment. Not the sharp, obvious kind people recognize and rush to name. I mean the quieter kind. The kind that settles into a relationship so slowly you start calling it adulthood. Routine. Stability. A mature version of love. That was what I was doing. Renaming my unhappiness so I wouldn't have to look at it directly. After that conversation on the couch, I think this is just what happens over time. Something in me changed. Not all at once. I didn't suddenly decide Ethan was the wrong person. I didn't wake up one morning with clarity and a packed suitcase, and the sort of cinematic certainty people mistake for strength. No. I kept going. That's what most people do. I kept making coffee in the morning while he checked the news on his phone. I kept asking what he wanted for dinner. I kept ordering groceries, answering work emails, folding laundry that smelled like both of us, and performing the subtle maintenance required to keep a life looking seamless from the outside. The problem was, once I had heard the way he said it, calm, practical, already decided, I couldn't stop noticing all the ways he had quietly withdrawn from me. Not cruelly. That would have been easier. Cruelty gives you evidence. It leaves fingerprints. This was softer than that. He still kissed me goodbye when he left for work. Still asked whether I needed anything from the store. Still texted if he was running late. He was not neglectful in the obvious ways. But intimacy isn't only measured by presence. Sometimes it's measured by attention, by curiosity, by whether the person beside you still seems interested in your inner life, or whether they've started relating to you as a role they trust will remain stable. Girlfriend, partner, home. I was all of those things to Ethan. What I was no longer sure I was visible. A few weeks after that first conversation, I tested something. Not deliberately at first. More like instinct. We were eating dinner. Salmon, rice, roasted broccoli, one of those healthy, balanced meals that makes a relationship look better than it feels. The TV was off. Music was on low in the kitchen. Rain tapped softly against the windows. It should have felt intimate. Instead it felt arranged. I set my fork down and said, casually, I've been thinking a lot about whether I want to stay in Seattle long term. Ethan looked up. Not alarmed. Not even particularly interested. Just attentive enough to answer. Really? Yeah. Why? There was a time in our relationship when that question would have opened a real conversation. We would have drifted into possibilities, fears, places we imagined ourselves, versions of the future neither of us could prove, but both were willing to explore. Instead, I heard myself say, I don't know. I guess I've just been wondering what else might feel different. And he nodded. Actually nodded. Then took another bite of food and said, makes sense. That was it. No follow dash up to and no different how. No are you unhappy? No do you want something else? Just makes sense. I don't know why that hurt as much as it did. Maybe because I had handed him an opening into something real, and he had treated it like weather. Not because he didn't care, I think. Because he didn't understand there was anything urgent in it. Or maybe he did understand. And had grown used to believing that if I needed more, I would eventually say it plainly enough to force him to respond. Either way, I sat there in our softly lit kitchen and realized I could say almost anything as long as I said it gently enough. It would pass through the relationship without disturbing its structure. That was when the tension began to harden into something I could feel. Because a relationship that absorbs everything without reacting is not always strong. Sometimes it's just numb. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. To him.to myself.to what our life actually felt like when I stopped narrating it as good. I noticed that he asked practical questions almost exclusively. What time's your first meeting? Did the landlord reply? Are your parents still coming in May? Can you grab more oat milk? Useful questions. Necessary questions. The kinds of things people need to know to coordinate a life. But usefulness and intimacy are not the same thing. Weeks went by. Spring moved in the slow Seattle way. More light, still rain. Everything green and damp, and slightly undecided. Work got busier for both of us. I traveled less than he did, which meant I was often the one home first, the one who started dinner, the one who listened for the elevator, and tried not to resent how quickly my mood became dependent on whether he entered the apartment feeling available or already halfway gone. There is a form of grief specific to relationships that haven't ended. You grieve in secret, while still participating. You grieve what used to happen naturally. You grieve the older version of your own hope. You grieve the effort it now takes to feel close. But because nothing is officially wrong, you don't know where to put that grief. There's no ceremony for it. No one sends flowers because your partner no longer asks what's going on in your head. So you carry it quietly. That's what I was doing. Then came the dinner. Not the dinner in a cinematic sense. No betrayal, no announcement, no scene. Just another dinner with friends that changed the way I understood my relationship. We were at a place in Capitol Hill, one of those restaurants with dim lighting, exposed brick, small plates meant for sharing, and servers who looked like they might secretly have better lives than the people ordering from them. There were 6 of us around the table, 2 couples we'd known for years, and 1 friend from Ethan's office. Her name was Maya. 32, maybe. Sharp, funny, effortlessly social in the way some people are when they've never had to learn how to relax in groups because they were simply born with it. I'd met her before, but only briefly. That night, Ethan came alive around her. Not flirtatious. I need to be precise about that. If he had flirted, maybe the story would have become easier. Cleaner. I could have hung my pain on something visible. This was subtler. He listened when she talked. Asked follow-up questions. Remembered details from stories she had told weeks earlier. Leaned in. Not with his body exactly, but with his attention. He smiled more. Laughed more easily. He looked like the version of himself I had been missing. And he offered that version to someone else without even seeming to notice he was doing it. That was the discovery. Not some message on a screen. Not lipstick on a collar. Not a secret. Just attention. Real, bright, unguarded attention. I sat across from him and realized, with a coldness that started somewhere under my ribs, that the man I had been waiting to get back for months was still here. He just wasn't coming home to me. I don't think anyone else at the table noticed. Why would they? Nothing inappropriate was happening. 2 people having a good conversation. That's all. But when you are the person starving inside a relationship, you become exquisitely sensitive to where nourishment is being offered. And what hurt me most was not jealousy. It was clarity. The problem wasn't that Ethan had changed into someone less capable of presence. It was that he had stopped choosing it with me. On the walk home, I stayed quiet. Seattle at night was wet and silver, the sidewalks reflecting streetlights in long broken ribbons. Ethan walked beside me with one hand in his coat pocket, talking casually about the restaurant, the office, something one of his coworkers had said. I heard none of it properly. My whole inner life had gone still. Not empty. Still. Like a lake right before you realize the ice is thinner than you thought. When we got home, he kicked off his shoes and asked, "You okay?" "You were quiet after dinner." I looked at him then. Really looked. At his familiar face. The man I had loved for 8 years. The man who still remembered my coffee order, and carried the heavier grocery bags and knew exactly how I liked the thermostat set at night. And I asked the question I had been avoiding for months. "Do you still feel curious about me?" He frowned slightly. "What?" "Curious," I repeated. "About me. About who I am now. About what I think. What I want. What's changed." The room shifted. I could feel it. The old apartment. The warm lamps. The damp coats by the door. The whole evening narrowing around the answer. Ethan stared at me for a second too long. Then said, slowly, "Of course I care about you. That's not what I asked." He exhaled. "Lena, where is this coming from?" That question. I think every woman who has stayed quiet too long knows the violence of that question. Not because it's loud. Because it implies the feeling began in you. Suddenly, irrationally, detached from context. As if loneliness needs an origin point other than a months you spent swallowing it. "From the last 6 months," I said. He ran a hand over his face, tired now, or maybe just unwilling. I feel like you're reading into things. That was the twist. Not that he denied it. That he genuinely believed nothing had happened. Because to him, maybe nothing had. No major fight. No disloyalty. No betrayal. Just a relationship softening into autopilot. But autopilot is only harmless when both people agree to become less alive. I didn't. I had just waited too long to say so. I stood there in our apartment and felt something inside me fall into place with terrible calm. Not a decision yet, but the beginning of one. Because for the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining the distance. I wasn't. I was simply the only one suffering enough to name it. Once you see it, you can't go back to not seeing it. That's the problem with clarity. It doesn't arrive loudly. It just settles. And after that night, everything felt different. Not because Ethan changed. Because I did. I stopped explaining things away. Stopped softening moments so they would fit into the version of our relationship I wanted to believe in. Instead, I started noticing. Really noticing. And what I saw wasn't dramatic. That's what made it worse. It was consistent. Subtle. Quiet. But impossible to ignore once I let myself see it clearly. The next morning, we sat at the kitchen counter with our usual coffee. Same mugs. Same routine. Same silence between us. But this time, it didn't feel comfortable. It felt empty. Ethan was scrolling through his phone. I was watching him. Not in an obvious way. Just observing. Waiting. Hoping, maybe, that something would feel different. That he would look up. Ask something real. Say something that wasn't about logistics. He didn't. After a few minutes, he said, "I've got a long day today." I nodded. "What about you?" "I'm working from home." Nice. That was it. Conversation over. And for the first time, I didn't fill the space. I didn't ask a follow-up question. Didn't try to keep it going. I just let it end. And in that moment, I felt it. The full weight of what had been missing. Not words. Connection. Presence. Something alive between us. I went back to the bedroom after he left. Sat on the edge of the bed. And asked myself something I had been avoiding for months. If nothing changes, can I stay like this? The answer came faster than I expected. No. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just clear. That was the turning point. Not a fight. Not a discovery. A realization. That what we had wasn't enough anymore. And it hadn't been for a while. That day I worked. Answered emails. Took calls. Moved through my responsibilities like everything was normal. But underneath it, something had shifted. Because now I wasn't trying to protect the relationship. I was trying to understand it. And once you switch into that mindset, everything becomes data. Every interaction. Every silence. Every moment. That evening, Ethan came home later than usual. "Sorry," he said, dropping his bag by the door. "Work was crazy." "It's okay." And I meant that. Because it wasn't about being late. It wasn't about work. It was about everything else. We ordered takeout. Sat on the couch. Watched something neither of us really cared about. And halfway through, I turned the TV off. Ethan looked at me. "What are you doing?" "I need to talk to you." That was the moment. The one I had been building toward. The one I couldn't avoid anymore. He sighed slightly. Not annoyed, but bracing. That told me everything. "What's going on?" he asked. I took a breath. And said the truth. "I don't feel like I'm in a relationship anymore." The words hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. Ethan stared at me. "What does that mean?" "It means we exist together. But we're not really connected." A pause. Then, "I think you're overthinking this." There it was. The sentence that breaks something quietly. Not because it's cruel. Because it dismisses the reality you're trying to name. "I'm not," I said. "Yes, you are," he replied calmly. "We're fine." That word again. Fine. I shook my head slightly. "No, we're not." He leaned back. Frustration starting to show now. "Lena, we don't fight. We get along. We have a good life." "I know." Then what's the problem? That question. That was the discovery. Not something I found. Something he didn't see. "The problem is, I don't feel seen anymore," I said. Silence. Real silence this time. Not comfortable. Not easy. Honest. "I'm here," he said. "I know you are." "That's not the same thing." He frowned. "I don't understand what you want from me." That hurt more than anything else. Because it meant He hadn't been trying to understand. Not deeply. Not in a way that required effort. I want you to care about who I am now, I said. Not just who I've always been to you. Another pause. Longer this time. I do care, he said. I just don't think everything needs to be that intense all the time. That sentence. That was the twist. Because it showed the difference between us. For him, this was enough. For me, it wasn't. And suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about right or wrong. It was about mismatch. About two people who had slowly grown into different needs. Different expectations. Different definitions of what love should feel like. And neither of us had noticed. Until now. I looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see the man I was building a future with. I saw someone who was comfortable in something that I was quietly suffocating in. And that realization. That was the emotional climax. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just final. Because once you understand that, you can't pretend anymore. You either accept it, or you change it. And for the first time, I knew exactly which one I couldn't do. Clarity doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like loss. Because the moment you understand something fully, you also understand what it means. And what it might cost. That night, after I said it, I don't feel like I'm in a relationship anymore. There was no explosion. No shouting. No dramatic ending. Just silence. The kind that settles in slowly, and refuses to leave. Ethan sat across from me on the couch, leaning back slightly, his arms resting on his knees. Thinking. Not reacting. That was his way. Always processing first. Always staying calm. I think you're expecting something unrealistic, he said finally. His voice was steady. Measured. Reasonable. And that made it worse. Unrealistic. I repeated. Yeah. He gestured slightly, like he was trying to explain something simple. Relationships don't stay intense forever. I'm not asking for intensity, I said. I'm asking to feel connected. We are connected. No, we're not. That was the first time my voice shifted. Not louder. Sharper. Because I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew. Ethan exhaled slowly. I don't understand what changed. There it was again. The gap. For me. Everything had been changing. For him. Nothing had. That's the hardest place to meet someone. When one person is living in awareness. And the other is still comfortable. I changed, I said quietly. He frowned. What does that mean? It means I stopped ignoring how I feel. A long pause. Then, so this is about you? He asked. That sentence. It landed heavier than anything else. Not because it was wrong. Because of how he said it. Like my feelings were something separate. Something individual. Something that didn't belong to the relationship itself. Yes, I said. It is about me. But it's also about us. He shook his head slightly. I think you're making this bigger than it is. And that was the moment everything became clear. Not what he said. What he couldn't say. He couldn't meet me there. Not because he didn't care. Because he didn't see the need. And that's something you can't force. I stood up slowly. Walked a few steps away. Then turned back. I don't think we want the same thing anymore, I said. The words felt strange. Not dramatic. Just honest. Ethan looked at me. Really looked this time. And for the first time, I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not confusion. Concern. You're serious, he said. I am. A pause. Then, you want to end this? That question. It carried weight. Because once it's said, everything shifts. There's no going back to before. Not fully. I don't want to keep living like this, I said. That's not the same thing. He stood up now. Slowly. Like he was trying to catch up to something that had already moved ahead of him. So what are you saying? I'm saying, I don't think this is working anymore. Silence. Real silence. Not comfortable. Not easy. Final. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. That's it. That question. It almost broke me. Because to him, this felt sudden. Like something had appeared out of nowhere. And to me, this had been building for months. That's not fair, he said. I didn't even know there was a problem. That hurt. Because it was true. And also, not enough. I tried to tell you. I said. When? That night on the couch. That wasn't. He stopped himself. But I knew what he was going to say. That wasn't serious. Exactly. That was the problem. It had been serious. I just didn't say it loudly enough, clearly enough, urgently enough. And he didn't hear it. Or maybe he didn't realize he needed to. I didn't know it mattered this much, he said. I know. That was the hardest part. Not that he didn't care. That he didn't understand. And understanding is what creates connection. Without it, you're just two people trying to make something work. And sometimes, that's not enough. We stood there for a moment, looking at each other. 8 years. All of it. Sitting quietly between us. And I realized something then. This wasn't a failure. Not exactly. It was a slow ending. One that had been happening for a long time. We just hadn't named it. Until now. So what happens now, he asked. His voice softer now. Less defensive. More real. And for a second, I felt it. The version of him I had been missing. Present. Open. There. But it came too late. Not because it wasn't real. Because it wasn't consistent. And I couldn't build a relationship on moments. I think we let each other go, I said. The words fell heavy. But right. Ethan nodded slowly, like he was trying to accept something he didn't fully agree with. Okay, he said. Just that. No argument. No fight. And somehow, that made it harder. Because there was no villain. No clear reason to blame. Just two people who had slowly stopped meeting each other in the same place. We spent the rest of the night talking. Not about fixing it. About understanding it. What we missed. What we didn't see. What we might have done differently. It wasn't emotional in the way people expect. It was quiet. Honest. And that's what made it real. Later, when I was alone in the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed. The same place I had sat that morning. But everything felt different. Not because something had broken. Because something had finally been named. And once you name something, you can't pretend it isn't there anymore. That's the part people don't talk about. The moment after the decision. When everything is still technically the same. But you know it won't be for long. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel confused. I felt clear. And that clarity, even though it hurt, felt like the beginning of something real. The hardest part isn't leaving. It's accepting that nothing was dramatically wrong. And leaving anyway. That's what people don't understand. They expect a reason they can hold. Something obvious. Something that justifies the ending. But sometimes, the reason is absence. And absence doesn't look like enough. Until you've lived inside it for too long. The next few days felt unreal. Not chaotic. Not emotional in the way breakups are usually described. Just quiet. Ethan and I moved through the apartment carefully. Like we were already adjusting to a life where we no longer belonged in the same space. We didn't argue. Didn't try to change each other's minds. Didn't suddenly become different people. We just accepted it. And that made everything feel more final than any fight ever could. We talked about practical things. Who would move out? What to do with the furniture? How to explain it to friends? All the things that make an ending feel real. But underneath that, there was something else. Something unspoken. A kind of understanding. That this wasn't a sudden decision. It was the result of everything we hadn't addressed. Everything we had allowed to fade. Everything we thought didn't matter enough. Until it did. One night, a few days later, we sat on the floor of the living room. No TV. No phones. Just space. Boxes half-packed around us. The life we built together slowly coming apart. Ethan looked at me. You know what's strange? He said. What? I thought we were doing better than most people. I smiled slightly. I did too. A pause. Then, I didn't realize you felt this way, he said. I didn't realize how much either, I replied. That was the truth. Because feelings like this don't arrive fully formed. They build. Quietly. Until one day. You can't ignore them anymore. I wish you had told me sooner, he said. I looked at him. I did. A small pause. Just not in a way you could hear. That was the lesson. Not about blame. About awareness. About how easy it is to miss something important. When it doesn't show up loudly. I think I got comfortable, he admitted. I know. I thought if things weren't bad, they were good. That's what I thought too. We both laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it was familiar. Because that's how most relationships drift. Not through conflict. Through comfort. And comfort can slowly replace connection if you're not careful. I don't think either of us did anything wrong, he said. That sentence. It mattered. Because it changed the way I saw everything. This just stopped being right. I nodded. Because that's exactly what it was. Not broken. Not toxic. Just incomplete. And once you see that, you can't force it to become whole again. Not without both people wanting the same thing. In the same way. At the same time. And we didn't. Not anymore. A few days later, I packed my things. Clothes. Books. Small pieces of a life that had once felt permanent. And as I stood there, looking at the apartment for the last time, I expected to feel something dramatic. Sadness. Regret. Fear. But what I felt was different. Calm. Not because it didn't hurt. Because it made sense. And sometimes, that's enough. Ethan stood by the door. Hands in his pockets. Watching me. This feels weird, he said. Yeah. A pause. Then, are you sure? That question. It mattered. Not because it changed anything. Because it gave me one last chance to be honest. Yes, I said. And I meant it. Fully. For the first time in a long time. Fully. He nodded slowly. Okay. No argument. No attempt to stop me. Just acceptance. And that was the final confirmation. We were already done. We just hadn't said it yet. I walked out of the apartment, closed the door behind me, and for a moment, I just stood there, in the hallway, holding everything that was left. And I realized something. This wasn't the end of something good. It was the end of something that had stopped being enough. And that's an important difference. Because leaving something good feels like a mistake. Leaving something incomplete feels like truth. So if you're watching this, and your relationship feels fine, ask yourself something honest. Not whether you're avoiding problems, but whether you're still connected. Because the most dangerous place to be is in something that works, but doesn't feel alive. And the hardest decision you'll ever make is walking away from something that isn't broken, but isn't right anymore.